Rebel forces have reignited Syria's long-simmering civil war, with largely Islamist fighters storming into the country's second-largest city. The Syrian army concedes it has lost control of large parts of Aleppo, which it had held for 8 years, and is vowing to retake them. It's the biggest flare-up in years in a civil war that has seen involvement by Russia, Iran, the U.S., Turkey, and Israel.
Celebrating their victory, rebel fighters are in the streets of Aleppo, back 8 years after being driven out under devastating government and Russian airstrikes. They're rejoicing at what they believe is a crushing defeat to President Bashar al-Assad. Stomping on the statue of Assad's father, former President Hafez al-Assad. Thanks to God, and after 8 years of being displaced from it by the Assad family and his criminal machine, today we return to Aleppo by the will of God. We return to our country. It is an indescribable feeling to return to your country, your land, the place you were brought up. The surprise offensive by multiple rebel groups began Wednesday in the northwestern province of Aleppo. Thousands of fighters swept through villages and towns, capturing government checkposts and military vehicles. But Assad's government, which is backed by Iran and Russia, has been responding with airstrikes. According to a monitoring group, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, Russian airstrikes have hit Aleppo for the first time in 8 years in an effort to push back the rebels. Syria's military says it's withdrawing troops from the city, aiming to prepare a counter-offensive. Many have lost their lives in recent government and rebel attacks in a war influenced by global and regional players. For almost 13 years, Assad has been at war with opposition forces who seek to overthrow him. The conflict has killed an estimated 500,000 people. Some 6.8 million Syrians have fled the country. And now the recent offensive has reignited the fighting with an intensity not seen in years.
Let's bring in journalist Karim El-Gawhary, who's following the story for us from Cairo. Karim, let's talk about the timing. Why have the rebel groups decided to attack now?
Well, first, it's the first bigger military activity since the agreement of Astana between Turkey, Russia and Iran that calmed down the conflict at that time. It remained a low-level conflict, but now, of course, that changed. The time, I think, has a lot to do with the weakening of the regime's allies. First and foremost, Hezbollah itself, that were always one of the foot troops of the Assad regime, of course, now weakened by what happened in Lebanon. Second, Russia, the second ally, being very busy in the Ukraine war and withdrawing a lot of forces from Syria because of that. Then third, the other ally, Iran, being very busy with itself, and its influence really weakened in the last weeks by the war in Lebanon. All that left the President Assad in Syria in a very vulnerable position, and that's now, of course, what the rebels are going to use.
Let's talk about that. Let's talk about that some more. I mean, Syria's military has announced a temporary troop withdrawal from Aleppo to, as we mentioned in the report, prepare a counter-offensive. But at the moment, just as you're referring to, they don't appear to be particularly robust for that. Well,
Assad's regime is really at a low point, not only because of what I mentioned before, but also after the Astana agreement, when this became a low-level conflict in the north, it promised its people an improvement of their lives. In reality, the economy is a disaster. This improvement was never delivered. Sanctions played an important role. In addition to that, the regime itself, positions of the regime itself were bombed over the last weeks by the Israeli Air Force, also weakening the regime troops itself. So The big question now, if the regime really can pull off a big counterattack to reoccupy Aleppo.
This might very well be a singular moment. Karim, might this success in Aleppo embolden the rebels to open more fronts elsewhere in the country?
I think that is really the most important question of the hour. And there are, of course, scenarios that the opposition might widen into other areas. And one of the most likely scenarios here would be the south of Syria, the area of Deraa, right at the Jordanian border. That is an area known for its opposition to the regime. That is an area where 2011, the uprising against the Assad regime started. If that will happen, that would mean big trouble for the regime, because it would have to fight on two totally opposite fronts. One in the further out north, and the second in the most southern part of the country. That would be really trouble for the regime.
How united is the opposition force leading the attack?
Well, I think that's the most difficult question. And I think right now we have more questions than answers. Part of this rebels and opposition is, of course, a hardcore Islamist movement. Others are on a Turkish payroll. Turkey is now also, of course, using the chance that Iran and Russia are weakened. One of their main goals is to weaken the Kurdish opposition, the Kurdish parts of northern Syria. And last but not least, there are a lot of rebels who had to escape in the last years from Aleppo, and now they're returning back. People that going back, like there's heartbreaking scenes of a son, for example, being reunited with his mother after so many years. So it's a mix of all this, and we don't really have supervision right now who is fighting where, and especially about the question is, what is the political agenda of these rebels after these areas are liberated? And of course, the second question is, will the regime have enough strength to fight back? So a lot of really open questions. And right now, actually, very few answers.
Our thanks, as always, to journalist Karim El-Gawhary in Cairo.
And we can now speak to Fawaz Gerges. He is professor of Middle Eastern politics and international relations at the London School of Economics and joins us from Istanbul this morning. Welcome to DW. What are the rebel groups hoping to achieve in the city of Aleppo?
Well, they want to, their overarching aim is to destroy the Assad regime. We have reports that they have entered Aleppo. Aleppo is the second largest Syrian city. It's the cultural capital of Syria. It was an economic powerhouse. Its capture by the Syrian government in 2016 was a turning point in the war, in the Syrian war. And the question is, will its capture, when and if the rebels capture Aleppo, will it really be a decisive moment, as decisive as the 2016 moment for the rebels this time?
And just how well equipped are these rebel forces? Do they have what it takes to actually hold their positions in the city of Aleppo?
This is a very important question you're asking. We have been really watching the rebels' videos, and they're using really heavy arms, including drones. Drones have really played a major part in their offensive, effectively really targeting the Syrian army positions. And they seem to be really well equipped. And this tells you a great deal that the rebels, both Islamists and the nationalists, have been really preparing for this moment for a long time. It was a major shock, really a military earthquake. What surprises me the most is that many Syrian army positions have folded very quickly. The advance has been very quick, very shattering. And the question that the Syrian government and most of us really trying to understand, will the Syrian government be able to mobilize enough forces to stop the advance of the rebels? Will Syria be able to reconstitute its forces under fire? Will Russia and Iran really send arms and support for the Syrian regime? It seems to me that yes, Russia and Iran have promised in the past 24 hours to send reinforcement for the Syrian government. We have to wait and see how this particular advanced shock attack really unfolds in the next few days and next few weeks.
Well, as you just mentioned, remarkable how little resistance the Syrian government forces seem to have shown as the rebels approached. What does that tell us about perhaps the kind of support that the rebels have among the civilian population? Just how much support is there for this initiative, this offensive rather, against the Assad regime?
It's really very surprising. What surprises me the most is the vulnerabilities of the Assad government, how vulnerable the Syrian army is. Years of Israelis' attacks on the Syrian army have really undermined and weakened the Syrian army considerably. President Bashar al-Assad allies, Russia and Iran, are preoccupied somewhere else in the Ukraine, in the killing field of the Ukraine, in Gaza and in Lebanon. And also what we need to understand is that the rebels seem to have really coalesced, created a joint military operation rooms. And yes, they do have some support. The fact is, you're talking about thousands of rebels, both Islamist, nationalist, and jihadist rebels coming together and really shocking the Assad regime. And the Syrian army seems to have been really caught napping. Yet, it's early. It's still early. We need to be really cautious about making generalization. The Syrian army is mobilizing. Reinforcements are arriving. And who knows, they might be able to really reverse and retake some of the towns and villages, even though what we are seeing is the reigniting of the Syrian war that has really never ended. It has been simmering for the past 4 years, and now it seems to me a very bloody phase. Thousands of displaced people, hundreds are being killed. This is the last thing we need. Another war zone in the Middle East after what we have seen in Gaza and Lebanon and elsewhere in the region.
Let's get some context from Bente Scheller. She is the head of the Middle East and North Africa division at the Heinrich Böll Stiftung in Berlin. Thank you so much for joining us. A first question is whether you can tell us more about these militants. HTS is the group. Who is supporting them and where are they getting their resources?
Good evening. HTS is one of the big factions controlling Idlib, which is the last rebel-held province in the northwest of Syria. And they were the strongest group. They are supported by Turkey, but I think in this offensive, Turkey does not have the leading role. Turkey is just not interfering. It lets these rebels go. And many of them actually are from the villages around Aleppo. So for them, it is return. They come home from displacement, so to say.
Now, the group seems to be advancing without much ground resistance. Will they stop in Aleppo, or it looks like they're moving beyond? What's the plan? What have they said and articulated?
From what I see, they are moving down south towards the province of Hama, which would be another big city in Syria. And that is, of course, quite interesting because you have different factions controlling northern Syria. And if you look at Aleppo, those who are controlling the city or who came into the city are mainly HTS, Islamist rebels. But there is the international airport that is under control of the Kurdish forces that are mainly in Syria's northeast. So that is already an interesting setting. The offensive continuing towards the south, to me, looks like possibly a hopeful signal that they will not fight with each other and against each other, but that this definitely might be a regime-directed offensive.
Now, the Syrian army says it is preparing a counterattack. Is the army strong enough to repel the rebel forces?
I seriously doubt that, because already in 2013, the army was down to half of its size, and it was said that Assad trusted only a quarter of the original army. So that has been a long time ago, and it has not been possible to rebuild the army. This is why Russia and Iran were so essential for Assad to keep him in power. They invested a lot and sent their own air force and many fighting groups on the ground. He seems to be abandoned by them now, because I heard these statements that they are very concerned. It does not seem as if this time they will come to his rescue.
Now, this civil war has been rumbling along for a few years, rather quietly with few major developments. Now we have this. It's been a surprise, it seems, to a lot of people. What do you think in terms of these events leading to a full-blown conflict once again?
It depends a lot on the Kurdish-Arab relations in the north, but it also depends on another area in Syria, which is the south, because the province of Dara, where the whole protests in 2011 started, the province of Sweda, as well in the south, we have seen protests there for more than a year. And if these also decided to take things into their own affairs, that might be a really turning point. And therefore, I think we have to watch out what comes up. Of course, everybody hopes that this will not lead to more bloodshed and violence, but we can't really foresee what will happen. But this definitely is a major development.
This is obviously not happening in a black box. There are regional dynamics in play. How do you think the global powers, Russia, Iran, Turkey, and the United States, are likely to respond?
The biggest question mark is possibly the United States, because we're here in the transition process from an outgoing government to a Trump administration that has not really shown a Middle East strategy in the past. But for Russia, I find it interesting that they are not doing much. And I think even their own positions were overrun in yesterday's offensive. So that is quite a surprise. It seems that they are dropping their ally and they are not willing to go to any length to support him any longer. Probably for them, Ukraine is more important. And for Iran, they are busy with their own affairs, and particularly Hezbollah, that was crucial as a militia to support the Assad regime on the ground. They have been decimated. They have been losing their leadership. So I think it is a very vulnerable moment for the Syrian regime, and a long-prepared offensive now by the rebels is coming in exactly that moment of opportunity.
Bente Scheller with the Heinrich Böll Foundation, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.